And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island, the naked city, the city of, well, 300,000 plus stories. We're going to dive into national as well as local news tonight. My first guest joining us in just a minute or so, of course, Byron he of the 1889 Institute. He is what we call here a frequent offender. He brings to us his clarity, his deep understanding of economics, and as importantly, his ability to make issues like this accessible. We're going to be talking about Medicaid, Medicare, Metascare, you name it. After that, we're going to have another pop-in from Daryl Gould as a new development broke from the Bristol Warren School District today. After that, Grant Welker from the Worcester Business News, who's joined us on a number of occasions. He's recently won a very important regional award for reporting. He'll be talking about the Worcester Sox and exactly what's happening there. And of course, somewhere around 8:15 or so, Kim Ruff, presidential candidate, Libertarian Party, for the 2020 election. We'll be talking about issues that concern you from a very, very libertarian perspective. So, let's get right down to it. It is with deep pleasure and a lot of respect that I introduce our next guest. He is the director of the 1889 Institute, econometrics, consulting / think tank based in Oklahoma, hence the 1889, the Sooner State. He has contributed to organizations like Goldwater and Heritage. He's been all over the place. The very first time we had him, he was talking about the impact of governmental expenditures on something as seemingly straightforward and reported often by the media, on the cost of living and the quality of economic growth that was taking place in a region. We cleared that up for us, and he's taken on a few concepts. And again, what's important here is accessibility. His most recent study is, of course, the record of Medicaid expansion in Colorado. Medicaid for all? It's a mantra that we're hearing all over the media now because of the upcoming presidential election. It is one of the primary talking points of the left as they encourage and continue to expand the importance of government in the day-to-day lives of average Americans. Byron, welcome back to the Coalition. Thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be with you.
Well, so let's do a little bit of, we've got some time tonight, so let's do a little bit of Medicaid, Medicare 101. Because for a lot of folks who, you're either in the system or you're not yet. Of course, the efforts of the progressive left would like to have everybody in the system, and that's where we're going to go. But if you will, can you give us just a snapshot on the difference between Medicare and Medicaid?
Right. Medicare is completely federally administered. It's completely federally funded. It's for retired folks, basically. It's for the senior citizens. It covers basic medical care for senior citizens. They have to make some co-pays. They can, depending on what they choose in terms of cost out of their own pockets, they can avail themselves of additional federally sponsored services such as low-cost prescriptions. But again, that's entirely a federal program.
Right.
Medicaid is a federal state program for poor people. It was originally designed purely for the indigent. And depending on a state's wealth, there are studies that are constantly being done by the federal government that determine what kind of, how much subsidy states get for Medicaid. But generally, states cover about a third of the cost, and the federal government covers the other 2/3. And with the Obamacare expansion, states can cover a bit more, quite a bit more than just people who are in poverty. In fact, it can cover up to about 130. Well, any adult, even able-bodied adults, can be covered as long as their income is 138% of the poverty level and lower. And the federal government, with this Medicaid expansion under Obamacare, actually covers 90% of the costs, with states covering the other 10%. But again, with Medicaid, there is expense to states, whereas with Medicare, there is no expense to states.
So you've got a medical program, and you've got, first of all, and if you can, lead us into the relationship between this and Obamacare. Because in states like Rhode Island, which chose to go their own way, and with their own health care program, and then you've got states using a hodgepodge effect, and then you've got states who apparently are relying heavily on this federal program. So what do you see the most of out there, and what degree of effectiveness have these programs had?
Well, the bulk of states have expanded under Medicaid. About 36 states have expanded. All the states had programs that are really, it's a separate program, but something that they call CHIP, that is Medicaid related, which covered all children up to 200% of the poverty level. If they were in a family, again, with incomes up to 200% of the poverty level, they could be covered for health care purposes. Some states have expanded their Medicaid programs to well beyond 138% of poverty. And under Obamacare, initially it was a requirement that states expand Medicaid all the way up to at least 138% of the poverty level. That was part of the lawsuit against the Obamacare program, was to say that the federal government was commandeering the states, and that was actually struck down. So it became optional for states to expand. There are other aspects to Obamacare where higher income people can enjoy at least some subsidy of their health insurance purchases through so-called exchanges. Some states started to set up exchanges, but found out that was kind of difficult. So for the most part, in various states, you have these exchange programs where people buy private health insurance that's subsidized by the federal government, and almost all those exchanges are set up by the federal government. So you're right, there's a hodgepodge. There are a few states that run their own exchanges. You have Massachusetts, which is grandfathered in certain aspects of Romney Care, which was a progenitor to Obamacare. And frankly, I couldn't begin to describe all in detail all the differences from state to state.
Right. If there is one common denominator, they've all been incredibly expensive, haven't they?
They have all been expensive. Depending on, you read different stories about what's happened to the price of health care in various states as these programs have been expanded. Some states, there are claims, and I think there's some accuracy to them, that some states have actually saved money under Obamacare because, quite frankly, there were some states that already had expanded their Medicaid programs far and above the minimums required under Medicaid prior to Obamacare. And when Obamacare passed and it gave this 90% match instead of only a 60% match, those states did save money. But then there are other states like Oklahoma that if we expand Medicaid, or Texas, or any number of other states that have only the bare minimum, they cannot possibly save money by expanding through Obamacare. And some of those states, the fiscal burden has been fairly extreme. And part of the equation of all this, that this Colorado study that you mentioned earlier looked at, and that most of the time people fail to take account of, is how the healthcare industry responds to the availability of all this extra taxpayer money that can go to them. And the fact is that they respond by charging a lot more for their services. And so that increases the expense of expanding Medicaid greatly.
And that almost sounds like colleges. The more that you expand federal financing, it would appear that colleges may have, call me a cynic, may have inflated their prices.
No, you're exactly right. The two phenomena are exactly the same phenomena. Yes, they're two different industries, and they're not. Well, I mean, obviously in healthcare you have a lot of college graduates administering it, but that's about as much in common as they have,
Right.
except for the fact that government is throwing copious amounts of money at both of these industries. Thank goodness, I actually am glad that the government doesn't regulate the prices, but obviously all we've done is free up people in both of these industries to raise prices practically without end, as long as government is willing to throw more money at them.
So let's talk about Colorado. First of all, what was it about Colorado that led you to use it as, if you will, the host for your study? Because one of the things I want to talk about tonight is these are not simply academic exercises for you. This is not simply, hey, I have an idea. I'm kind of bored this afternoon. Let's do an in-depth analysis of the state of Colorado's healthcare system. You're talking about having to source all sorts of original statistics for programs that are still, in terms of the wider scope of history, in their infancy. So there's not been a lot of third-party analysis of real-time statistics, and ultimately your studies are always based on actual behavior, actual money spent. Again, actualized history, aren't they?
Right. And actually, the only reason for featuring Colorado is that they did their own official study. It's a government agency that actually produced a study that came to certain conclusions. What all I sought to do was make those conclusions accessible to the general public by rephrasing them and explaining them fully. And what this Colorado agency found was that instead of prices, so every time you have the health industry in a state advocating for Medicaid expansion, one of the major reasons they argue that it's justified is that once you cover more people under Medicaid, supposedly more hospital bills will actually get paid. Right. They're constantly claiming that there are all these deadbeats that come to the emergency room, get treatment, and then don't pay the bills. Well, that means, according to their argument, that they have to raise the prices on everybody else in order to cover those unpaid bills. Well, if you cover these people, these deadbeats, under Medicaid, now when they come into the emergency room, the bills are paid, right? And so that means that the costs, the prices for everybody else should go down because now they don't have to cover those bills anymore. Well, if that's true, by the way, what they call this is cost shifting. If you expand Medicaid and cost shifting is supposed to go down, then the prices should go down. What they found in Colorado was, in fact, hospitals' prices went up. In fact, they went up faster than ever once they expanded Medicaid. And what you find is that their hospitals' profits go way up, and the health industry in general becomes financially much richer. They also spend a whole lot more on various things in hospitals. Basically, they have the ability to become even less efficient than they already are, so they do. And none of this is surprising from an economic behavioral point of view, but it runs completely opposite of what the health industry, the health interests, the special interests claim on a regular basis. And by the way, Colorado is not the only place where a study like this was done. I didn't go back in and do a lot of repeating of a study that was done in Arizona, but it wasn't done by an official government organization. It was done by the Goldwater Institute, but they found exactly the same thing happening in Arizona.
Right.
I featured the Colorado study because it came from a government agency. At last, we have official confirmation of this phenomenon.
Right. Now, what's fascinating to me is what services or what economics really is, and that's pretty broad-based statement, right? The one aspect of economics that seems to be completely lost on folks, particularly in the government sector, is that economics is as much a predicator or an analysis or a predictor, if you will, of human behavior as it is
Right.
an analysis of real dollars. In fact, the dollars that are impacted are often a symptom, whereas the potential disease is the human behavior. And the human
Exactly.
behavior is a function of what changes societally, and very often it's externalities created by government that change the human behavior. As someone who is a true economist, not just someone who's, say, an expert who plays one on the radio, right? As someone who's
Right.
a legitimate economist who's been economist who's been well published, have you ever seen government really accept that fact that it's human behavior that we need to study?
No, in fact, that's one of the complaints about how government does all of its economic analysis. It assumes when a government program, when fundamental changes are made in a government program, whether how things are paid or how it's administered, and incentives fundamentally are affected, the government assumes that that behavior doesn't change when it does its fiscal analyses. And the fact is, in fact, people's behavior does change when you fundamentally change the incentives by changing the payment structure or increasing the payments or creating payments where payments had never been before. People are going to respond to that. And look, this is the thing. On the one hand, I have no problem with people in healthcare and who administer hospitals, so-called nonprofit hospitals, whatever. I don't care how much money they make. On the one hand, I am more than happy for people to get independently wealthy providing health care. In fact, that benefits me, right? Because I want there to be innovation in healthcare and people to be pursuing that profit, because it means there are more cures. And if I get ill, it's more likely there's going to be a treatment for me, regardless of what the illness might be.
Oh,
What bothers me is when they go to legislators all over the country, in every state, and to the federal level, and they claim and they cry poverty. Oh, we're nonprofit hospitals. We need more funding. People aren't paying their bills, and we're in poverty. And of course, you don't really need to see their finances to see the lie that is.
right.
All you have to do is go to a major urban area and see all the cranes putting up more hospitals. If they were so unprofitable, why are they building more? But that's the part that bothers me, though, is the manipulation and the lying. And, I'd have more respect if they came out and they said, look, I want a vacation home in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and the only way I'm going to get that is if you increase funding for Medicaid.
Right.
Because that fundamentally is what's going on. They get another bigger house and a nicer pool and more servants, and we get maybe marginally more health care. Let's hope. The other thing that bothers me about this system is the presumption behind it. This idea that's increasingly common that health care is a fundamental human right. Well, this is the problem I have with that. Every good and service requires a human hand to produce it. which means that if you have a fundamental human right to something that has been produced, you have a fundamental human right to someone's human effort,
Right.
their labor. There's a name for when one human being has a right to the production of another human being, the labor of another human being. That's called slavery.
Exactly.
And that, at its most basic, is the problem with that proposition that healthcare is a fundamental human right.
No, absolutely. There's some stunning facts in this, and things that I'm not sure if the average, very aware, very political individual realizes. You talk about 10 cents on the dollar, and that 10 cents on the dollar represents the actual percentage of healthcare costs that are paid for directly by the consumer. In other words, whether it be on their little copay card, whether they stroke a check, whether they go couch diving, whatever it takes, right?
Right.
Again, one of the themes of tonight is that economics is not an analysis of math, it's an analysis of human behavior. So as we know, when folks don't have to write a check for their income taxes or their Social Security or their FICA, when it just magically disappears as part of their paycheck, and all they see is that direct deposit amount in their bank, they lose connection with what true costs of government are, and the true costs of their schools or any other aspect of their civic life. We've gone to the point where, as you pointed out in your report, that individuals have lost touch with what it truly costs. And it's a double-edged sword because, number one, they're not aware of the real market costs because we have no idea what the real market costs are because there is no real market.
That's right.
And number two, again, getting to the human behavioral issue, we are quite frankly very happy at 10 cents on the dollar to order unnecessary tests, to go down every path imaginable. And it's not that you and I are advocating for, and this is one of the favorite terms, ironically, of the right, but in this case, the left might throw us, you don't care about human beings. You're going to support death panel. No, it's understanding the relationship between money and what people are willing to spend on healthcare. And isn't that the whole conundrum?
Exactly. Look, because we pay so little of the total bill, and that, of course, that's an average. I pay more than 10% of my healthcare bill because I have a high deductible health savings account type of system that I'm under for my health insurance. But a lot of people pay a whole lot less than 10%. So this is all averages out. And the fact is that the vast majority of Americans aren't particularly price sensitive when it comes to their health care. Consequently, when a doctor walks in and says, well, I want to do this test, that test, this test, we don't really ask questions about it. We don't ask whether or not it's truly necessary. And we get charged a lot for things that we shouldn't be charged a lot for. Some years ago, my wife broke a foot, and we were charged nearly $700 for a plastic boot. It turned out, I found out later, that I could have gone on the internet and bought that very same boot for $70. These kinds of overcharges, this is a feedback effect because we're not paying attention to the prices. The providers can overprice, quite frankly, and overcharge. There's not really a market mechanism there where we can go back and forth and determine what the actual price ought to be for many of these services. So they charge, frankly, with impunity. And
I was
what
say,
that means is,
yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
What's weird about this, well, what I call a catch-22, is that we're afraid now to pay for health care ourselves because the prices are high. Healthcare is very expensive. If you happen to see the bill that's sent to the insurance company, you panic that you might not have had insurance. Mm-hmm. But we need to realize that prices are so high precisely because we do not pay for healthcare ourselves. The price, if we were paying for healthcare ourselves rather than through insurance, private insurance, and government, Medicare and Medicaid, and the VA and the many other programs that pay for health care, in government, prices for healthcare would be a whole lot lower. I mean, by several times lower. We're not talking about just half as much. We're talking about less than half.
Yeah, and to your point, when you talk about the boot, for example, you bought it on the internet for $60. Clearly, a significant number of Americans do not go out shopping for their,
No,
mechanical healthcare needs on the internet. We don't even
right.
really understand what, $60 is a great price when you're comparing it to 700, but we don't even really know what the true market price would be because there is essentially no true market for it in the global sense.
No, you're exactly right. Now, I suspect $70. I think the price would be lower than that.
Absolutely.
Quite frankly.
Yeah, because
And when I look at, frankly, it was very comparable to a ski boot. And you can buy cheap ski boots for less than $70 each.
right.
And so, no, and by the way, and they're still a whole lot better at that price than this little plastic boot. You're right. We don't really have a firm idea of what the prices would be. The one thing that I can say with some degree of confidence is that something like 2/3 of the, right now, healthcare takes up almost 20% of our GDP. It's about, I think it's 17.9 was the last number I looked at. It was right at 18%.
Right.
It would probably be closer to 6 or 7% if healthcare prices hadn't gone up so much faster than other prices in our economy.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's doubled just within the last 20 years. Healthcare prices have doubled within the last 20 years. That all of that is directly attributable to the involvement of government and the fact that there are third parties paying our bills instead of us ourselves. And keep in mind, private health insurance, the kind that we get from our employers that pays for regular checkups, which isn't really insurance at all, that exists purely because of our tax system, because we do not income tax benefits. It's a tax avoidance mechanism that Congress declared legal in the 1950s, and that first started happening during World War II when we had wage and price controls. It was a way for companies that were limited in how much they could pay to compete with other companies that had paid more before the war started. Mm-hmm. And so all of this has come about because of government policy rather than any kind of a market mechanism at work.
Yeah, there's another staggering number that hits you right between the eyes when you read the report. And by the way, we did, with Byron's permission, we did post the report on the coalition site, and we actually referenced it in the run-up to his appearance today, in the publicity that we put out there with a link to it. When we put this out in podcast form, and we'll talk about our new podcast avenues, in just a few days, you're going to be, and you can go to your younger friends and point out that not only will you be on iHeartRadio, you're going to be on Spotify. So you can be a Spotify choice in your friends, teenagers, children's playlist now. Bet you didn't know that. But we will provide a link to the report. It's 4 pages, the top side analysis, if you will, and it's worth your reading. But one of the numbers that just hits you right between the eyes is that, according to this study, 37% of Americans' health care is paid for by either Medicare or Medicaid. 37%. I mean, in dollars, that's got to represent trillions?
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have it off the top of my head. It's
quadribazillions.
Billions on top of billions.
Yeah.
So you have more than a third paid by Medicare and Medicaid. You have it's getting close to half with private health insurance. The rest is only 10% of it is out of our own pockets. Then you have the Veterans Administration, various state programs that pay for health care that aren't, they're just a whole stack, a huge number of other programs that pay tiny percentages, but it all adds up. And so, yeah, we, for the most part, just don't pay our own bills. And that means that think about how healthcare competes today. If you look at, you do see these nonprofit hospitals advertising for business. They never talk about their prices. They never talk about how much less they charge than the competition. They only tell you about the wonderful services they have, and sometimes they'll tell you how nice their rooms are. They advertise on what kind of equipment that they use, which oftentimes they're buying equipment that they don't really need. But what economists call that is non-price competition. And when you have non-price competition, well, to put it bluntly, that's the costliest kind of competition you can have.
Absolutely. I mean, and think of it. You wouldn't go to a restaurant. I know you and I wouldn't. Maybe there are a few in our listening audience who would. But you wouldn't go to a restaurant and simply order off the menu without understanding what the prices are. And eliminating rebates to middlemen, which is a subject we covered on a show a few months ago when we were talking about price fixing and ways to help the healthcare system, and simply having an avenue for which people can get a price for the medication in advance, for the procedure in advance, is simply just not part of the daily recipe, is it? I mean,
No, it isn't. Yeah, exactly. If you're like me, you have a health savings account,
mm-hmm.
you mostly pay cash for your health services. You walk in, you ask for a price of something, and you simply cannot get it. Walk into an emergency room with an emergency, but not life-threatening. Ask them how much it might cost if they give you an X-ray, or
Mm-hmm.
how much it might cost that they're fixing to sew up a cut that isn't life-threatening. You could perhaps go to another hospital. They're not going to give you a price. They're going to tell you, well, we'll bill you later. Don't worry about it.
Right.
And certainly they do bill you later, and they bill you a lot. My son, some years ago, broke his leg, and we went into a hospital, and the doctor there briefly reviewed an X-ray and called an orthopedist that we could go see the following Monday, which meant that my son had to spend a weekend in a simple splint without actually having his legs set, which meant it was very painful. And we got a bill from that doctor, an emergency room doctor, just that doctor alone, for $700. $700 for what amounted to all of a few minutes' work. And he was charging us more than the orthopedist charged us in total for several casts and multiple X-rays. This is the kind of, frankly, highway robbery that they can get away with simply because they presume some insurance company is going to pay the price. And sure, yeah, the insurance company gets a discount, but how much do they really care? All they have to do is go and raise premiums on employers, and meanwhile, the patient himself doesn't even know fully what the premiums are for the insurance that they enjoy. We are so insulated from what's being charged in the name of our own health care that it's just ripe for abuse, and therefore it's abused.
Absolutely. Ultimately, the way I like to refer to the situation is that healthcare is delivered in a spiritual manner. We, as parents, for example, would never think of, if you will, drawing a more equivalent between the cost of a procedure and our child's welfare. We simply don't do that in the United States. It needs to become a transactional event. And it's interesting because anecdotally, it would appear that the one sector of the healthcare industry that approaches it anecdotally, which are these standalone, very often independent of hospital emergency healthcare centers, which ironically offer very often better hours, board certified doctors, and some price lists are
Yeah,
often, I mean, here in Rhode Island, for example, are often almost impossible to open because of the regulatory burdens that are placed and the hurdles that are placed in front of them. Yet, not just for the convenience factor, which is ultimately what's, what's focused on by the media, and they don't represent attacks on the American way of life, which is what the hospital and the medical groups would have you think, simply because they drill down procedures into a purely transactional event, not unlike what happens when you take your car to get fixed. Right? They have become the bogeymen of the medical industry because, quite frankly, they scared the bejesus out of these folks because
that's exactly right.
they represent
One of
market
our
forces. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
right. One of our board members, Keith Smith, is an anesthesiologist, and he helped start the Oklahoma Surgical Center here in Oklahoma City, and they advertise their prices online.
Oh,
If you need a particular procedure, you can look it up and find out what the price is going to be. Now, there might be, if they have to hedge a little bit, there'll be an asterisk and it'll explain a few things to you. But the fact is, they're a cash basis surgical center.
right.
And he has pointed out that the doctors who work with him charging much lower prices than these nonprofit hospitals do for exactly the same procedures. Those doctors make more money than the doctors at the nonprofit hospitals do. The fact is, there's so much in the way of men and waste in the system today when third parties are paying the bills that it is very easy. If they wanted to, if they needed to, it would be very easy for them to cut their costs and provide better care than they are right now. Think about it for a second. Because of the fat in their system, they have the ability to they can withstand things like malpractice lawsuits, and they've become lazy about it. Even before Obamacare passed, a gentleman from New York who called himself a Democrat wrote about how American healthcare killed his father, and it was because his father got an infection, one of those antibiotic-resistant infections,
Right.
in the hospital. And the simplest way to prevent those infections, which happen all the time and kill thousands every year, is for the doctors to wash their hands. My own father, a retired medical doctor, will tell you that in his 30 years of practice, he never prescribed antibiotics after he sewed somebody up. And he did not have a problem with infections. The reason was he cleaned the wound. He cleaned the wound extremely thoroughly.
Right.
I've witnessed it. I know that without anesthetizing the wound, no one would have been able to stand that cleaning. But the fact is, he didn't have to prescribe antibiotics. They don't thoroughly clean wounds today. You wonder what happened. What happened to make medicine seem to take a step backward in terms of its knowledge of septic theory? And the answer is simply they're fat and lazy because of the third-party payment system. It's hurting people as much or more than it's helping anyone.
Right. No, and so we've got this curious divide taking place. We are emotionally absorbed with the impact of the medical industry, yet intellectually completely detached. It has become, and to your point earlier about the commercials, that are so predominant with these, one of them, for example, is a national cancer hospital that's got branches throughout the country.
Right.
And I'm not questioning their medical acumen for a second, but their advertising is focused exclusively on gauzy, hazy pictures that are spiritual in nature of people fighting cancer, overcoming the odds, that whole battle, which, by the way, I don't question for a moment the importance of gearing up someone who is a patient in an extreme situation against an extreme disease. You have to enter that with that type of tiger mentality, all right, because you're going to experience pain, you're going to have to medicate, you're going to have to probably change your style of living. The economics, it's great. But simultaneously, we continue to do an injustice to folks in this country because the economic impact of our healthcare system on the family structure, whether it be the ongoing expense, which is often well into 5 figures per year for a non-subsidized, if you will, non-government funded option, that is regular folks, is enormous. And I'm not looking for another set of regulations from the government to tell me what they have to disclose and what font type they have to disclose it in, on which web pages, and how many minutes. I'm not looking for any of that. I'm not looking for a terms and conditions report from a website. What I'm looking for is the allowance, if you will, the introduction of market forces into the medical system so that independent rating agencies can pop up, much like they do for restaurants, and give really detailed third-party analysis and reviews and success rates from individual practices and individual approaches. I'm looking for a fact-based cost analysis of what different approaches are, because that needs to be part of the issue as we continue to bankrupt an entire generation of Americans because of medical expense. And the only way that can happen properly is if the free market is introduced into this otherwise fantasy land that we live in called our medical system.
Exactly. We've got to know what the prices are. And look, healthcare, as I said earlier, it's taking up a fifth of our economy. A fifth. Think about that for a second. A fifth of our economy is going just to pay for healthcare.
Right.
And we have the goods on the fact that that's not paying for increased productivity in healthcare. It's not paying for increased volume of healthcare. Most of what that's paying for is just the increased prices of healthcare.
Right.
And think about what that's doing to the national deficit. It's taking over, healthcare is taking over state budgets everywhere.
Right.
And that means there are other priorities, whether it's education or police or firefighting or any number of other real priorities, things that there are real losses to having one industry absolutely dominate in our economy. We obviously have to do something about it, and I think there's a consensus that we have to do something about it. You have one approach that says, okay, what we'll do is we'll provide health care for everybody. Obviously, we can afford it. Obviously, there's a lot of waste, but the way we'll do it is we'll regulate, we'll fix prices, and that way we'll bring down the cost, but everybody gets it. That's one approach. That approach inevitably will lead to low quality, low innovation, and we will be denied services that we enjoy right now. There's no doubt about that.
Right.
You can look at all kinds of examples, the old Soviet Union, Venezuela, any number of examples of socialism taking over an industry entirely, and what happens. The other approach is move toward a free market system. And you can do that partly by expanding the health savings account system and rolling back some of these government programs. That system promises what we get in markets: lower prices, more efficiency, and yet better service. I don't even see why there's an argument over which approach to use, quite frankly.
Well, there's an argument because in largely every aspect of our lives now, you could take that old term military-industrial complex, drop off the military, and achieve the same effect.
Right.
Education, there's an entire industry that surrounds it where enormous amounts of money are spent with no expectation of results and no way of measuring that industry's impact. There's an entire industry that surrounds law enforcement. Now, that has little to do with keeping the streets safe, has little to do with violence, stemming violence. It has everything to do with supporting an out-of-control bureaucracy. And on and on and on. And the same thing is true, clearly, of the medical industry, because there are so many situations, there's so much low-hanging fruit in everything that I've mentioned that we should be able to at least spiritually agree on, let's address the low-hanging fruit. We can argue then politically, we can argue our philosophy, we can do all of that later on, but let's address the low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit in the medical industry is, number one, tort reform. Okay, that's a whole nother show. Okay. Number two, introducing, and I hate to have government do it, but some manner of introduction of price transparency in the market, some measure of regional or national price competitiveness, dropping down those barriers so that we can gradually move away from this massive central planning that's occurring now and move into a more of a market-based economy. And then again, like I said, then we can argue from there. Because ultimately, if you introduce free markets, the energy, the displacement, the chaos that it wreaks almost instantly on the static statist approach very often takes care of a lot of the problems themselves. But again, that's behavior, and that is the prime function of economic analysis.
Right. When it comes to tort reform, there are some studies that I've read that argue, and pretty persuasively, that lawsuits represent an amazingly small percentage of the costs in the healthcare industry, which makes you think, well, maybe, okay, I'm not going to say tort reform isn't in order. It definitely was in Texas when I lived there. And it practically, lawsuits practically eliminated OBGYNs from the border area in Texas. After tort reform, they started repopulating that area. So I know tort reform is important, but that's like many of the things that they talk about in healthcare. They talk about, oh, well, part of the reason the costs are so high is because of technology. We have all these expensive technologies, and they're very expensive, and we have to buy these machines. Name me one other industry in the history of all of mankind where improvements in technology increased costs. There's not one. That is just a claim that is, it's pie in the sky. It just comes out of nowhere, yet people seem to believe it. I think tort, I'll tell you where it increases costs. It's an excuse, just like technology. When my wife I mentioned this personal experience with my wife with her broken foot. She had to have surgery. That the doctor admitted that he opted for one procedure just because he wanted to prevent any possibility of us suing him later in life in case she got arthritis in this joint. And my feeling in that case is, then why am I paying for it? If it's for the doctor's benefit to protect him from a future lawsuit, why isn't he paying for it? But the reason I wasn't paying for it is because insurance was involved. It didn't bother me that much that he did a procedure on my wife for his own benefit and charged me for it. Mm-hmm. It's insulting. I can't even begin to talk about how immoral I think that was.
Right.
But that goes on all of the time in medicine. And so over and over again, I hear them talk about, well, these are the sources of the increased cost. We need to make a mantra of it. Healthcare is expensive because of third-party payer. That's the reason healthcare is expensive. It's not expensive for any other reason. All those other reasons are excuses. They're made up reasons for the expense in healthcare.
What would you say to people who then would counter and say, well, we need to go to single payer?
Yeah, sure. Let's go to single payer, and then we'll be in line for any kind of special procedure. Up in Canada, it works really well if you have a simple break in your arm. But if you have anything like a somewhat exotic disease or physical condition that needs major surgery, you're going to be standing in line, and you might die from it before you finally get treated. The stories of that from Great Britain, from Canada, and from other places in the world are so numerous. I don't know why we have to keep telling them.
Well,
that's the problem with it. Look, if I have the ability to save my life with the resources I have, I ought to be able to do that. But under single payer, you're prevented from doing that. Again, it comes back, that's the other side of the coin when it comes to enslavement. And that's what single payer is. We all have a fundamental right to health care. That means you have to enslave somebody to get it done.
Right. Well, again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you joining us. The clarity you bring to these issues based on economics, numbers, behaviors, as opposed to theories, myths, feelings, is astonishing. And that's always been the value of the work that you folks at 1889 do.
Thank you.
It's moving beyond myth, moving beyond urban legend, moving on beyond heartfelt beliefs, and actually confronting issues based on, well, truths. Which is why we tell people that they need to be able to move, including their diet, if you will. Look upon your daily media, news, ingestion. Think of that as a diet. And then think of the things that you consume every day. If they continue to be third-hand reporting of someone else's reporting, which is based on a press release, things aren't going to continue to work out so well. On the other hand, whether it be 1889, Fee, Goldwater, you've got intelligence that is accessible at your fingertips. So tell folks how they can find out more about 1889, where they can continue to read all of your work, your accumulated work over the years, and give us a flavor too, if in fact the spirit moves them, how they can support you guys.
We are on the internet, www.1889institute.org. We also are on Facebook, and you can access a blog that we've begun recently from our website as well.
Right. So any ideas you want to tease us just a little bit on things that you're working on right now? That anything in the pipeline that we need to keep an eye out for?
Well, you and I might enjoy talking about a critique I'm about to write on economic models and all this argument that somehow or another government can manage the economy and grow the economy. That one might be fun.
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Well, Byron Schlomek, he is the director of the 1889 Institute, of course, 1889institute.org, where you can find this study. We'll continue to have him on as guests. And again, we consider it a real privilege that you're willing to join us, particularly on a Friday night. The invitation's still there, buddy. If somehow you make it to Socialist Workers' Paradise here in the Northeast, and I know that may require some, I have this mental image of you getting off on the tarmac at TF Green or Logan Airport and going into a Harry Potter-esque collapse because of the sheer pain that you feel. But that aside, if you can manage to make it up here, we have a big coalition welcome to you and your family if you can join us at some point. But again, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to having you on again in the very, very near future.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. We're going to take a quick break now. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here on the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. On the mighty, mighty Twitter at Coalition_Radio. The mothership, CoalitionRadio.us. As importantly, we are now on Spreaker, iHeartRadio, and we're even on Spotify. So take a look out for the Coalition Radio. We're going to put links up all over the place. So if somehow this isn't quite enough while you're driving to the beach, you can inflict us on your teenagers. Just kind of subtly insert us into their playlist. We're going to take a couple-minute break right now. We're going to bring on some other guests. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.